presentation is on communication, emotion regulation, and frustration in autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a developmental disability characterized by persistent impairments in social communication and interaction, as well as the presence of restricted, repetitive behaviors, interests, or activities. Current prevalence of ASD is about 1 in 54 children, which makes this a significant concern. Communication deficits are a well-recognized characteristic of ASD. These deficits include both the impairments in the use of pragmatic language, or the social use of language, as well as structural language, like syntax or grammar. Many children with ASD develop their language abilities later compared to their typically developing peers. Some even remain nonverbal throughout their life. In addition to the diagnostic symptoms and communication deficits, many children with ASD also display behavioral symptoms. These behavioral symptoms may look like heightened tantrums, aggression, uncontrolled outbursts, and self-injury. Many studies have found these expressions of frustration in ASD increase compared to typically developing children. Other studies have found that children with ASD have an increased negative affect, such as frustration, and a decreased positive affect. This remains an important issue, not only because are these behaviors no fun for the children, but these emotional outbursts also affect the family's quality of life and family functioning. Reducing these behaviors in children with ASD can increase school success and socialization. One possibility is that emotion regulation may be causing these behaviors. Emotion regulation is the ability to modify a person's emotional state that promotes adaptive or goal-directed behaviors. Studies have shown that children with ASD are as much as 4 times more likely to have clinically impaired levels of emotion dysregulation, making this a significant difficulty. In a study where children were faced with a challenging situation and their emotion regulation strategies were monitored, children with ASD overall had less effective regulation strategies. One effective regulation strategy that children with ASD were lacking was positive vocalizations or encouraging self-talk. This could be related to the language and communication deficits often seen in ASD. Another thing that may influence children's emotion regulation and frustration is communication. There's some evidence of this done in typically developing children. For example, Cole, Armstrong, and Pemberton found an association between language delays and increased externalizing behaviors, or expressions of anger and frustration in typically developing children. The authors proposed a model about this relationship, suggesting that increased emotion communication, or the use of emotion words, helps to improve the emotional competence of the child, which provides them with the tools to better regulate their emotions. There's also an association between lower language skills and increased level of anger and fewer regulation skills. This relationship has also been studied in other populations. For example, children with specific language impairment have been found to have worse emotion regulation compared to typically developing children. Importantly, there are interventions that just focus on anger management that have not been found very effective, which leads to the question of, is there something else influencing emotion regulation and frustration in ASD that could provide an avenue for a more effective intervention? I'm proposing that communication could provide this avenue to help improve these interventions. The goal of my study was to address these issues and examine whether poor communication abilities and emotion dysregulation are an underlying cause to increased frustration in ASD. To do this, I examined this in school-age children with ASD and typically developing controls. We used parent report measures of communication, emotion dysregulation, and frustration. Based on previous literature, I hypothesized that children with ASD will have poorer communication, emotion regulation, and more expressions of frustration. I also hypothesized that poor communication will be associated with increased emotion dysregulation, and poor communication will also be associated with increased frustration. I've made these 2 predictions based on the theory that children with communication difficulties will have a harder time expressing their emotions and needs, and then they may become emotionally escalated because they don't have the tools to productively regulate them. And my 4th hypothesis is that increased emotion dysregulation will be associated with increased frustration. So I'm predicting that these expressions of frustration to be a result of poor emotion regulation. And these last 3 relationships I'm predicting will be especially true in the ASD group. My sample consisted of 34 children with ASD and 39 typically developing children, all between the ages of 5 and 9 years old. These groups were well matched on age and gender, which included a slightly higher sample of girls than typically included in ASD studies. All participants met the cutoff scores of 2 standardized parent report measures, fitting in their respective groups to confirm group membership. The first measure is a measure of communication, the Children's Communication Checklist, which is a commonly used standardized measure for measuring children's communication abilities. Parents rated the frequency with which children use specific language skills on a 3-point Likert scale on 70 items. This measure covers both structural language and pragmatic language. Structural language includes the subscales measuring speech, syntax, semantics, and coherence. An example of a structural language question is, it is hard to make sense of what he or she is saying, even though the words are clearly spoken. And pragmatic language includes subscales measuring initiation, scripted language, context, and nonverbal communication. An example of a pragmatic language question is, does not look at the person he or she is talking to. Items on the frustration scale consisted of 13 items measuring general frustration. These items were taken from the anger and frustration scale of the Children's Behavior Questionnaire, which is a well-known and well-validated measure with good psychometric properties. An example of a general frustration question is, my child gets angry when told to go to bed. An additional 5 items were added specifically designed for this study to measure children's frustration in communication situations. For example, my child gets upset when someone doesn't understand what he or she is trying to say. Parents rated how likely their children were to display particular behaviors on a 7-point Likert scale. The full scale had a Cronbach's alpha of 0.93, which is comparable to the psychometrics of the original scale. We use the emotion dysregulation inventory, the reactivity subscale, which measures intense, rapidly escalating, sustained, and poorly regulated negative emotional reactions. This is a recently developed measure by Dr. Carla Mazevsky, specifically to examine observable signs of a poor emotion regulation in autistic children. It has been standardized on a large sample of children with ASD. Parents rated the severity of their children's behaviors on a 7-point scale on 24 items. Examples of questions from this measure is, has extreme or intense emotional reactions, and hard to calm him or her down when he or she is mad or upset. Participants were recruited from a recent study in the lab, and parents completed questionnaires online through REDCap, and participants were compensated for their time. Now I'll share my results. The first 3 graphs I'm going to show you are the group differences on the 3 primary measures. Throughout the results, you'll see the ASD group in blue and the typically developing group in red. Differences are displayed on box plots showing the full range of scores. First is the overall composite score of the communication checklist, which is a standardized score with a mean of 100. The ASD group had lower communication competence compared to the typically developing group. As you can see, children with autism performed lower than controls, but it's also important to note that their average score was around 2 standard deviations below the mean, indicating that this sample of children with ASD had significant communication impairment. On the next graph shows emotion dysregulation, which are presented as T-scores and have a mean of 50. Children with ASD have worse emotion dysregulation than typically developing children. The typically developing sample is around the measure's average of 50, while the ASD group's average is almost 2 standard deviations above the mean. The last graph shows the average scores of frustration on the 7-point scale from the combined frustration questionnaire. We see the children with ASD had more expressions of frustration compared to the typically developing group. In the next set of graphs, we'll be looking at the relationships between these 3 domains. Because there were such strong group differences that were reflective of the ASD group, which were expected based on the literature, we have examined these correlations separately by group. In line with my hypothesis, there is a significant negative relationship between communication and emotion dysregulation in the typically developing group in red. As typically developing children are better at communicating on the x-axis, they are also better at regulating their emotions on the y-axis. However, contrary to my hypothesis, this relationship was not significant in the ASD group in blue. We see a similar pattern in communication and frustration as we did in communication and emotion dysregulation. Again, with the typically developing group in red, we see a significant negative relationship between communication and frustration. As communication competence increases, we see less expressions of frustration. This relationship is not seen in the ASD group in blue. These correlations were significantly different when tested with the Fisher's R-to-Z transformation. In both groups, we see a positive relationship between emotion dysregulation and frustration. The R value for both groups are around 0.5. This suggests that emotion dysregulation and frustration are moderately related, but also measuring separate constructs. To remind you, the frustration questionnaire items included items from an original measure that were looking at general frustration, as well as additional items that captured frustration in the context of communication. This graph shows the average scores and the standard error of the mean on the general frustration items from the Children's Behavior Questionnaire in the solid bars, and the new communication items in the striped bars. As you can see in the graph, there is a significant group by domain interaction, as well as significant effects of group and domain. The ASD group shows higher levels of frustration compared to controls in both domains. But the interesting pattern here is the within group differences between domains. The ASD group had less than a half-point difference between the two domains. The average control group was 2 points lower in the communication-related frustration compared to the general frustration. The addition of these items measuring communication-related frustration may have captured a domain that is particularly difficult for children with ASD, especially considering the low communication scores in this sample of ASD. And to summarize these findings, children with ASD exhibited deficits in communication, emotion regulation, and increased frustration when compared to the typically developing group. Emotion dysregulation is related to frustration in both ASD and typically developing children. And communication was related to both emotion dysregulation and frustration in the typically developing group, but contrary to my hypothesis, not in the ASD group. As discussed before, this could be related to the low communication scores of this sample of children with ASD. The relationships between communication and emotion dysregulation and frustration in the control group shows that these constructs are related, but there is something about the ASD sample that makes them unrelated in this group. One explanation for this lack of hypothesized relationship in the ASD group is that their average communication competence was too low for their communication skills to provide them with effective emotion regulation strategies and reducing their frustration. As a reminder, over half of the sample fell below the standard score of 70, which is what's typically used as a measure of clinical impairment. Additionally, while the Children's Communication Checklist is designed to be used with young children, it may not have been sensitive to pick up on the subtle differences in communication within the autism group. There were several limitations of this study that could point to future suggestions for future directions. As we just discussed, this study included children with significantly low communication abilities. While it is important for studies to represent this lower functioning children, it will also be important for future studies to look at children with higher communication as well, particularly in the context of this model. We can increase sample size to analyze emotion dysregulation if emotion dysregulation is a mediating factor between low communication and high frustration. Our sample size didn't allow us to examine mediating factors, particularly if we had a higher functioning sample. My communication measure didn't specifically measure emotion communication, which previous research has linked to emotion regulation. It will be important to examine emotion competence more broadly. And finally, there are a number of other factors such as expectations from caregivers and general cognitive ability that we weren't able to examine in the present study. Finally, many of these results can be clinically applied. The study shows that children with ASD had very high rates of emotion dysregulation and frustration, which, if not addressed, can affect children's social interactions, learning, school success, family functioning, and overall quality of life. But present results suggest that communication may not be related to difficulties in this area, at least in this sample. Many interventions targeting emotion dysregulation and behavior have some language or communication component to them, and many children with ASD may not be able to effectively participate in them. This study points out the importance of developing interventions that can be used for children with ASD who are younger and or have lower language skills. And thank you to my advisor, Dr. Luisa Bonetto, and my second reader, Dr. Carl Rosengren. And thank you to Jessica Keith and fellow Bonetto lab members. And thank you to all the families that participated in my study.